He was an educator with the Saratoga Springs School District for 38 years. And tonight he's going to talk to us about his father, Clarence Dart, and the Tuskegee Airmen. So with that, I'm going to just turn the microphone right over to Clarence. Good morning.
Well, good evening, class. I hope you can all hear me. Out your notebooks and pen. Oh, I'm sorry, Jamie didn't tell you. But anyways, tonight I am going to give you a little talk about the Tuskegee Airmen. But this talk is probably going to be a little bit different because I'm going to break it up into three parts. First, I'm going to talk about a little bit of history. Then I'm going to talk about the Tuskegee Airmen, about Clarence Dart. So you might be here for a little while, and I hope you don't mind. I was an educator for 38 years. I'm from a family of 8 children. Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Dart was my dad, Millie Dart, his wife, and then I have 6 sisters, and 1 brother has passed away, and then me. So there was 8 of us in our house. I will say this is going to be a history lesson for all of you, not a CRT. This is not about critical race theory. Schools are all worried about if they teach black history that it's critical race theory. This is not critical race theory. It's going to be history. Now this next part, my wife tells me that I never explain when I tell people that I'm going to do this, so I'm going to do this right up front in the beginning. I'm going to use the word Negro through hopefully most of this presentation if I don't forget. And the reason is, sitting at 33 Park Place one day, I finally asked my dad, and he definitely didn't like the big N word. He didn't like the word black or blackie. He didn't like the word colored or coons. And he wanted all people to be treated as people, all the same. So when I give this talk, I'm going to use the word Negro. Now, we definitely need a little bit of history. The first Africans came to this country in 1619 on August 20th. And they came on a Portuguese ship named the Treasurer. And they landed at Point Comfort, right outside of Jamestown. And they were traded for victuals. They were traded for food. So that's where our history begins. African Americans have been, oh, there we go, have been on this continent for over 400 years. So we're going to start with the, Jamie? Yep. Oh, I'm sorry, Jamie, go back for just a second. I wanted you all to read this when you first came in. Why would these men fight for a country that fought so hard against them in peacetime? And that came from a man by the name of Paul Lemire. It was a review of a play in the Daily Gazette called Fly. I don't read during February of 2022, but you would, if you did, you would have seen a 90-minute play on the Tuskegee Airmen. So take a brief moment to take a look at that. And hopefully, in your thoughts and listening tonight, you will understand why these men did what they did. Okay, now Jamie.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. In 1925,
the Army War College releases a report called "A Negro Manpower in War."
They came to the conclusion that Negroes are some species of human and do not have the smarts, courage, the integrity to be officers and certainly not pilots.
Benjamin O. Davis Jr. enters West Point in 1932 as its only African-American cadet.
For the 4 years that he attended, not one of his fellow students spoke to him.
Isolated and addressed only in the line of duty, Davis graduates in the top 15% of his class. He requests assignment to the Army Air Corps, but they did not train black soldiers to be pilots. With World War II approaching, the U.S. military remains segregated, restricting black soldiers to service jobs.
Most of America had doubts and a serious question about my capacity and my capability, based purely on my race.
We urge the President to use his broad powers to stop such grossly unfair policy. Walter White.
The settlement of vexing racial problems cannot be permitted to complicate the tremendous task of the War Department and thereby jeopardize discipline and morale. General George Marshall.
President Franklin Roosevelt faces a tight re-election race in 1940. Union leader A. Philip Randolph and the NAACP's Walter White meet with FDR that September because the black vote becomes pivotal. Not long after, the administration announces the Army will train black pilots for the first time. The Army Air Corps selects the Tuskegee Institute, founded by Booker T. Washington, to train black pilots. Eleanor Roosevelt, in Alabama for a related event, visits the institute.
She said, I've heard that Negroes can't fly, but I see you seem to be doing it around here.
Mrs. Roosevelt takes a flight with Chief Alfred Anderson, now known as the father of black aviation. Their photo will be seen nationwide. 4 months later, Benjamin Davis leads the first class of Tuskegee Airmen to graduate, eventually becoming commander of the all-black 99th Squadron. They deployed to North Africa in April 1943. For every bomber shot down in World War II, the Allied forces might lose 10 or 11 men. General Nathan Twining impresses upon now Colonel Benjamin Davis the critical importance of fighter plane escorts.
Colonel Davis said, your mission is to protect those bombers. Stay with them. Don't allow yourself to be drawn off by a decoy.
Under Davis's command, the all-black 332nd Fire Group earns the name Red Tail Angels, becomes the most effective escort group in the 15th Air Force, and white bomber pilots start requesting them by name. But while the Tuskegee Airmen in Europe fight Hitler, in the United States, they fight Jim Crow. Colonel Robert Selway commands the 477th, the first black bombardment group, on a base with both black and white officers. He segregates them even though Army regulations prohibit this.
He came up with an idea. He separated by classifying all of the white officers on the base as instructors, all of the black officers, 453 of them, as trainees.
In early April 1945, black officers organized a nonviolent protest, entering an officers' club restricted to instructors. Selway closes the club in response, making his segregation policy a base regulation and commanding every officer silent.
He decided he was going to have us read a statement signed that said we're going to obey it. I knew before I got there what I was going to do about it.
Selway orders the arrest of 101 black officers for refusing to sign.
If you do that in wartime, that's treason. You could be shot to death by firing squad.
Black press coverage embarrasses the War Department, leading General George Marshall to order the release of the 101 men on April 23rd. But Major General Frank Hunter, who enacted many of the segregationist policies against the 477th, adds letters of reprimand to each officer's permanent record.
After I'd been in the military about a week, I was going to stay for 30 years. I certainly didn't want to get out. But that letter,
Colonel Benjamin Davis replaces Colonel Selway, becoming the first African-American stateside-based commander in U.S. history. Morale improves, but the war ends before the 477th deploys.
We went into combat as a double V team. We said victory over Nazism and fascism in Europe and victory over racism in America.
3 years after the war ends, President Harry Truman orders the military to desegregate. The Air Force is the first branch to do so. But it's not for 50 years that Tuskegee Airmen will have Major General Hunter's letters of reprimand removed. In 1998, President Bill Clinton awards General Benjamin O. Davis Jr. his 4th star.
We dared not fail. We knew that we had the future of our people, not just ourselves, riding on our shoulders. And I dare say every one of us felt that way.
Okay, while Jamie's getting that slide up. So let's start with the revolution, or the colonial period. Negroes were given guns, that is the slaves, to defend forts, outposts, and settlements. But as soon as the insurrection was over, those guns were taken away. During the Revolutionary period, and you see this gentleman, John Murray, he's the Lord of Dunmore. He's also a governor for, believe it or not, New York State. So he had Virginia and New York. So what did Dunmore do? Well, Dunmore said to the slaves and the freemen, if you fight for Britain, I will give you your freedom. Well, George Washington wasn't going to do that with the colonial army. And when George Washington found this out, he also began to take Negro slaves. Of course, he didn't promise them anything, but he began to give them guns, and also he hired them as engineers to build roads. But then when the war was over, they went back into slavery. Then we move on to the Civil War, and there's a lot of history in between, but we'll move on to the Civil War. The 54th Regiment of Massachusetts fought with distinction. Then we have the Buffalo Soldiers, the 9th, 10th, 24th, and 25th Cavalry. They went out west to protect the Pony Express and also settlements. But I want to tell you a quick little story about one of the cavalry units, the 25th. And I think that this is important. The 25th Cavalry in 1903, and I'm jumping ahead, I know, a little bit, but they were sent to Brownsville, Texas, to Fort Brown. 167 of them. One night, a problem happened in Brownsville. I say a problem. Some storefronts got shot up and a bartender got killed. And the citizens of Brownville were up in arms. So they went to the fort and they went to the commander of the fort, and all 167 Buffalo soldiers, the cavalry, were arrested. Now, what's interesting about this is, when investigated, their rifles, their pistols, their horses didn't show any sweat. The guns had not been fired, yet they were still they were still charged. And this was under none other than Theodore Roosevelt, because in 1906, when he reviewed the case, he let it stand. Then we move to 1865 to 1877, which is the period of Reconstruction. Then we move on to 1877 to 1964, Jim Crow. And I want to stop there for just a second, because in 1866, if you are history students, you know about Rutherford B. Hayes, who was our 19th president, and Samuel Tilden. Well, just think about how large our country is at that time. Rutherford B. Hayes beats Samuel Tilden, who was also a New Yorker, by 1 electoral vote. So there was a debate in Congress over this, a filibuster. And so how do we get to Jim Crow? Well, we have what's called the 1877 Compromise, which is not written. And what that did was draw all of the soldiers, Yankee soldiers, out of the South. And then we have Jim Crow. Now, I'd like to explain Jim Crow, because I didn't know what Jim Crow was. Jim Crow was started by a man in the 1830s by the name of T.D. Rice. And what it was to make fun of Negroes. It was blackface. He used things like shoe polish, coal ash, anything that would paint his face black. So why Jim Crow? Well, it was a separation thing. We get Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And Mr. Plessy was a biracial man who sat in a railroad car that was mainly for whites, and he was arrested because he didn't get out of the car and move to the black car. So, in his arrest, he went before a judge by the name of Ferguson. And then it went all the way through to the Supreme Court, and because of the way our Constitution was written, we have separate but equal. So now what do you get? You get all signs in the South, mainly the South, that say colored only. If you went to a restaurant, you had to go in the back door. If you went to a movie theater, you sat in the balcony. You couldn't stay in a nice hotel. You had to find a rooming house. But it was separate but equal. Now, that wasn't so much in the North, although there was segregation in the North. But it was mainly the South. In World War I, we know about Henry Johnson in Albany. There's Henry Johnson Boulevard. Henry Johnson earns the Croix de Guerre avec palme, with a palm, from the French. And he was posthumously given the Medal of Honor for saving some of his men during World War I from President Obama. And also during the First World War, the French were asked not to fraternize with the Negro soldiers. Eugene Bullard flies for the French, also earns the Croix de Guerre. In fact, the Germans called him the Black Swallow of Death. And then in the 1920s, we wind up with pilots like Bessie Coleman. Bessie Coleman learned how to fly in France. In fact, before she went to France, she studied real hard and learned French so she could learn to fly. We have Herbert Julian, Dr. Herman Banning, who flew from coast to coast, and so that women, you are not left out. Willow Brown and her husband Cornelius Coffey start a flying school. So why am I telling you all of that? Well, as you saw in that film clip, oh, Jamie, you're good. As you saw in that film clip, in 1925, the War College came out, and what it really said was, Negro craniums were too large. They were promiscuous. They were superstitious. And they would steal anytime they get a chance, and they couldn't handle complex machinery. And I named all those pilots, and there are more, because they did handle that complex machinery. All right, now we're going to move on to the Tuskegee Airmen. As you know, September 1st, 1939, World War II breaks out. Negroes were beginning to want to be part of the action. Got to remember to hold the mic up. The federal government began to hear from papers like the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, and then, Negro churches, the NAACP, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, let's see. And those groups are really pressured for Negroes to fly. Now, let's see. In 1940, Roosevelt was coming up, as they said, on a tough election. He was up against a man by the name of Wendell Willkie. And he needed the black or the Negro vote. And so what did he do to help himself get that Negro vote? He took Benjamin Oliver Davis's father, Colonel Benjamin Oliver Davis Sr., and made him a brigadier general, because there were no black generals at this time. Also, his Secretary of War, not Defense. We don't get the Secretary of Defense until we get to President Truman. The Secretary of War was a man by the name of Stinson. Roosevelt asked Stinson to hire a man by the name of Judge Hasty to be his advisor. He also appoints Colonel Johnson as advisor to the Selective Service Board. During this time, in 1939, Chauncey Spencer and Dale White do a 10-city tour, and they meet a man by the name of Senator Truman. And Truman said that he would help get Negroes to be able to enter the Army Air Corps. Also, at this time, 1940, a young man by the name of Yancey Williams, a Harvard grad, an engineer grad of all things, had gone through what I'll mention in a moment again, the CPTP program, Civilian Pilot Training Program. And he was now a pilot, and he wanted to fly for the Army Air Corps. But the Army Air Corps said that they had no place for him. So he brought up charges to the federal government. But in the meantime, President Roosevelt has a law passed, Public Law 18, which establishes not the desegregation of the Army Air Corps, but a place, it expanded the Army Air Corps so that Negroes could get a chance to fly. As I've already said, there was a CPTP program, Civil Pilots Training Program, at college campuses, and now they were even establishing it at HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. We get to Tuskegee, Alabama. There was a fight over putting the flyers in Tuskegee. But Tuskegee won because of George C. Marshall. Tuskegee, as you know, was in the South. They said that it was because it would be warm there and the weather was better. Well, the Negroes had already established fields in the north at Harlem Field in Chicago and another field in Los Angeles. But George C. Marshall won out. And he was really expecting Negroes to fail. He didn't want to help them in any way. In fact, the Negroes were told before they could become pilots, they had to have 2 years of college. And then that was lowered to 1 year and then a high school education. And when we get to my dad, we'll talk a little bit more about that. You see a picture of Chief Anderson and Eleanor. Chief Anderson is flying what is known as a Piper J3 Cub. And the reason that he has the name Chief Anderson is because he became the chief pilot at Tuskegee. I remember when I first heard the story, I thought it was because he was part Indian, but that's not the case. It's because he was the chief pilot at Moulton Field. In fact, before Moulton Field, he was the chief pilot for the Tuskegee Airmen. Now, that young lady sitting in the back, it just so happened that Eleanor was in Tuskegee for another event. But she wanted an airplane ride. I'll tell you a little bit about the event that she was there for. Anybody ever heard of the name Julius Rosenwald?
Sears Roebuck.
Yes, yes. Julius Rosenwald was part of the Searbucks Roebuck owner, and he established a fund. And Eleanor Roosevelt, was a trustee of that fund. One of the trustees, I should say. I don't want to make it sound like she was the only one, but she was a trustee of the fund. And she procured from that fund $175,000 to help build Moulton Field. Now here's another story for you ladies about Eleanor Roosevelt. We don't know how true this is, but I like to tell the story. Eleanor was a feisty lady. And she was there with two Secret Service men, one young and one older, I should say. And the younger one went to the older one when Eleanor went to climb into the Piper Cub. He said to the older one, We should call the president and let him know that she's getting ready to take a ride. Well, the older one said to the younger one, why? He can't tell her what to do. He can't control her. And that's, in a way, that's true. Eleanor Roosevelt did not like the Secret Service. She wanted to be able to go anytime, anywhere she wanted. So I don't really know how true that story is, but I like telling it. Let's see here. Okay. I hope I can do this two hands. That's a picture of Langston Hughes. And can I get out of here? I kind of also want to give you a flavor of what was happening in our country. As you know, we were in the throes of a Great Depression, and people were looking for jobs. So Roosevelt establishes an executive order, 8802, which opened up the defense industry to everyone, Negroes and whites included. But it didn't stop desegregation. Or I'm sorry, it didn't stop discrimination. He desegregated the defense industry so that people could work. But the Negroes were given night shifts or shifts where white workers weren't working because they couldn't work together. You had to keep them separated. So here's what was happening in our country. I'm going to read a poem called Beaumont to Detroit, 1943. We've skipped ahead a little bit, but that's okay. And this man, Langston Hughes, wrote a poem about it. Here's what happened. In Beaumont, Texas, at the Pennsylvania shipyard, one night a man was accused, and I hope there's no kids in here, of raping a white woman. And there was destruction of automobiles and homes. Now this happened on June 15th, 1943. A week later, June 22nd, the same thing happened in Detroit. There was another riot because whites felt that Negroes were taking the jobs. So here's a little poem. Looky here, America, what you done done. Let things drift until the riots come. Now you're policemen, let your mobs run free. I reckon you don't care nothing about me. You tell me that Hitler is a mighty bad man. I guess he took lessons from the Ku Klux Klan. You tell me Mussolini's got an evil heart. Well, it must have been in Beaumont that he got his start, because everything that Hitler and Mussolini do, Negroes get the same treatment from you. You Jim Crowed me before Hitler rose to power, and you're still Jim Crowing me right this very hour. You say we're fighting for democracy. Then why don't democracy include me? I ask this question because I want to know, how long am I going to fight both Hitler and Jim Crow? That's how Negroes were feeling at this time. In the first class of Tuskegee Airmen, there were 13. And because of the way the Army Air Corps was working, all 13 of these men were already, I shouldn't say all because BO wasn't yet, but all of them were pilots. Guess what? Only 5 graduated. Only 5. BO almost didn't get in the class. BO was teaching military history at Tuskegee. But Captain B.O. Davis signed up to be in the Army Air Corps. They told him they had no place for him. And then when he went for his physical, he failed because the flight surgeon put on his medical records that he had epilepsy. Well, that wasn't true because as soon as the Army Air Corps opened up, B.O. Davis was asked to join that class, and then he became the commander of the 5 pilots. He graduated in class SE 42C. And I'm going to ask you a question like I do with the students when I go to schools. What do you think the SE stands for? SE. No. No. Well, it stood for single engine. They were all going to be single engine pilots. And then, what about the C? Well, this is real simple. Think of the year, the calendar of the year. Well, if we give January the letter A, and we give February the letter B, they graduated in March of 1942. The base commander at Moulton Field, the first base commander was Ellison, and he was a real stickler about keeping the men segregated. So was the next commander, Colonel von Kimball. And then we get to Major Noel Parrish. When my dad gets to Tuskegee, that is going to be his base commander. 2 stories about Noel Parrish. A young lady goes to town, and when she gets to town, she gets arrested. She's out of uniform. She was a nurse at the base, and she walked into a store and they thought she was stealing. That's the first story. The second story is a pilot goes to town and he gets accused of drunkenness, and the 2 police officers go to arrest him, and an MP draws his gun, an MP from the base, a Negro MP, draws his guns on the 2 police officers. The next thing you know, the pilot and the military policemen are in the hospital, and word gets back to the base, and they grab guns and they load up on a truck, and they're ready to leave the base to go after the police officers that put these men in the hospital, and Noel Parrish stops it. And that's when Noel Parrish said that the base was going to be desegregated. But when the pilots left the base, they were going to go into a segregated city. So when you were riding the bus around the base, you could sit anywhere. But as soon as the bus left the base, you had to move to the back of the bus. And all of the pilots that were training the Tuskegee Airmen were white. And I forgot to tell you, so I'm going to back up just a bit. We talk mainly about the pilots. There were over 10,000 men and women that could also be considered Tuskegee Airmen. You have to remember this. The cooks, the nurses, the doctors, the weathermen, the maintenance men, the crew chiefs, the truck drivers, anybody that worked in the PX had to be black. The radio operators had to be black. So there was over 10,000 men and women, because nurses included, had to be Negroes. In fact, my dad got to know Ma Rainey, who was arrested, pretty well. All the men on the base, even though she was Lieutenant Rainey, they called her Ma Rainey because she looked after them. Moulton Field is the first field. And then a year later, the Army built Tuskegee Army Airfield. And the 99th, which my dad was a part of, B.O. Davis was the commander of the 99th. That was the oldest Negro fighter squadron. There were three others: the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd fighter squadron. But my dad wound up part of the first. Okay, Jeannie. Okay. Wish there was a faster way to do this. Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Dart. I've now put on a flight jacket to change the subject a little bit. Clarence was born in Elmira, New York. He grew up during the Great Depression. He was born December 6th, 1920. He was the son of Clarence William Dart and Catherine Dart. And I like to tell people that he was born December 6th, 1920. That was approximately 17 years after the Wright brothers' first flight. And I tell that because my dad was always interested in airplanes. And if you think about the first airplanes, I think the reason why people liked them so much in the early beginning was because they flew low. They were mainly biplanes. There were some monoplanes, but not that they were completely underpowered, but they flew low and people could see them. And there was barnstorming going on at carnivals. My dad went to the Elmira schools, and he graduated 1939. Oops. Yes. I did. He enjoyed building model airplanes. My father didn't go to college, though, because my grandparents couldn't afford it. My grandfather worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad, and my grandmother was a domestic worker. And during the Depression, there wasn't, I should say, a lot of money. So what did my dad do? He went to the Elmira Aviation Ground School, and he learned how to work on radios, he learned how to work on airplane engines, airframes, but he never got a ride in an airplane. In the summers, he worked at Harris Hill. And if any of you have ever been to Elmira and know anything about Harris Hill, it's the glider capital, well, it was the glider capital of the world. On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor gets bombed. The day before, which was a Saturday, December 6th, my father turns 21. He was in church singing, or not church, but he was at a radio station singing with his church choir when he got the news. Well, he and a buddy on their way home went to tell their parents what they wanted to do. My dad walked in the house and he told my grandmother, "I want to join the Navy." Well, my grandmother said to him, "No way are you joining any man's Navy or Army." She put her foot down. But my dad, being the way he was, found out that the Army Air Corps was coming to Elmira, and he took the test, and he passed the test, all but the eye test. Now, you know, you can't fly if you can't see. Well, the Army Air Corps told them that they would be back to Elmira in 6 to 8 months. When they came back, he passed the test. It was a depth perception test. I don't know how many of you have been in the cockpit of an airplane, but when you're coming down, sometimes if you have poor depth perception, coming down for a landing can be really tough. Taking off isn't so bad, but after you've been up there for a while, it can be a little bit rough. I was fortunate enough to be able to fly with Dad a few times, and we don't have time for those stories. But in the meantime, before going to Tuskegee, my dad gets a letter from Uncle Sam, and it says, "You're drafted." We can go to the next. He gets a letter from Uncle Sam saying, "You're drafted." So they send him to Fort Niagara, and they give him a survey, things that he would like to do. And he lists all the things like operating radios. He was a mechanic, you know, able to fix airplanes. He also told them that he wanted to be a pilot, but he also told them that he had already gotten orders from, he didn't have them with him, but he already gotten orders from the Army Air Corps that they were going to send him to Tuskegee, but he didn't have his orders with him. So where did they send him? They sent him to Fort Sill in Oklahoma to become an artilleryman. He said that he enjoyed learning how to fire the guns, artillery, shoot pistols and rifles. But then the commander came to him, his unit commander came to him and said, "Clarence, I think you'd make a great second lieutenant." Well, my father said no. And the reason that he said no was he knew what was happening in Japan. If you were a second lieutenant in an artillery group, you were the forward observer. Who do you think is going to get hit first? Yeah, well, yeah, That's the way my father thought, and he said, no way. I don't want to be a second lieutenant. And then, so my dad disobeys orders. Any of you that are military people, you know the chain of command. If you want to do something, you go to your unit commander goes to the next person, all the way up the chain. Well, my father was on guard duty, so what does he do? He writes a letter to Washington. And they didn't send the letter back to him, but they sent it to my grandfather. And it said in the letter, Clarence, tell your son we know where he is, and when his class comes up, we will send for him. And that's exactly what they did. My grandfather told Clarence not to worry. The base commander got the letter, but he didn't tell my dad that he had the letter. He waited until it was nighttime, and now my dad had to rush around packing his trunk, and he had to get a ride into town, so the guys threw him on a truck and took him to the train station so that he could get to Tuskegee. My Moton Field is now a historical site, and that's where my dad first learned to fly. But first, you had to go to ground school. Ground school was at Tuskegee, and you took all of the things to learn about the aircraft, and then you went to Moton Field to learn to fly. Now, that's the first plane that my dad learned to fly in. It's a PT-17 known as a Stearman Cadet. And the Cadet is spelled K-A-Y-D-E-T. Now, that's a PT-17. What do you think? And I'll treat you like I do students. What do you think the PT stands for?
Primary trainer.
Primary trainer, that is correct. So PT-17, and a little fun story about this one. My dad gets his first flight, and he'd never been in an airplane before. And he's flying with his instructor, and he's having a great time. And the instructor says, Clarence, take us back to the field. And my father says, yeah, I can take you back to the field. And so now he's got the controls of the plane, and he's looking all around. And all of a sudden, the instructor takes the plane, tips it up on the vertical, and says, there's the field right there. And that's when my father said to himself, I'm never, ever going to get lost again. And Mr. Peck is in the back somewhere, and he can tell you about our trips to Oshkosh. But yeah, my dad promised that he would never, ever get lost again. That's called a BT-13. BT. Basic trainer. And my dad called these planes the VULTEE, V-U-L-T-E-E, vibrator, but it's really the VULTEE Valiant. But he said before they took off, they would shake like crazy. So you had to make sure you were really strapped in. But he said that once you got them into the air, they were not bad airplanes. And in basic, he learned a little bit about instrument flying and, you know, general everyday control of an airplane. Jamie? This next aircraft is known as an AT-6 Texan, AT, Advanced Trainer. And the reason why this was an advanced trainer was that they could do night flights in this, and it had retractable landing gear. Now, when my dad was learning instruments at the Tuskegee Army Airfield, one day he had a horrible day. He was learning how to fly instruments, and nothing went right. And finally, when they got back, usually when you got out of the cockpit of the airplane and you stood on the ground, waited for your instructor to get out, you saluted your instructor and waited for a debrief. My father said he told the instructor when he got out of the plane what he could do with his airplane. And so now my dad is thinking that he too is washed out. But the next day when he went to leave the base, he looked on the board and his name was still up. And after that, he did well. And I must say that all of the instructors up until 1945 were white. In fact, he said in this airplane, his instructor turned this plane, the AT-6, upside down. Well, the AT-6, unless it's been equipped, the fuel won't flow right, we'll put it that way, into the engine. So when it was upside down, they were sort of gliding towards the earth, and my father says, oh no, this isn't right, we're going to be goners. And then the instructor flipped the plane over, and everything was fine. The engine started up again. Let's see. Overseas training, thanks, Jane. Overseas training was done at Selfridge Field in Michigan. And this is my dad's instrument ticket that he earned at Selfridge Field before they went overseas. He went overseas from Fort Patrick Henry, Virginia. It took 9 days to get to Oran, Morocco. Now, you couldn't tell your girlfriend or your significant other where you were. So they came up with a code. And the code was this. They're now in Morocco. They sent out their letters and they said, we're at Rick's place. Yes, yes. And so that let everybody know kind of where they were because they weren't supposed to tell. Go ahead, Gene. My dad winds up in Capodichino, Italy, which is near Naples, after being in North Africa for a little while, learning how to do strafing missions. He was first, because everybody thinks that the Tuskegee Airmen were the 332nd. Well, I'll tell you when they became the 332nd, but he was with the 79th fighter group, and but they were, the 99th was still detached. They had their own area on the airfield, and but they still flew, but they were only assigned strafing missions. And my dad flew a P-40. In the meantime, there was a General Momeyer of the 12th Air Force, because the 99th was with the 12th Air Force, who sent a letter back to Congress stating that these men were not disciplined, they were poorly trained, and they weren't handling the aircraft well. Well, that wasn't true, and thank goodness for B.O. Davis and the person that B.O. Davis was, because he happened to be in Washington at that time, and he gave a talk to Congress that explained what the men were doing. And when Congress and the Army Air Corps actually investigated, they found that the Tuskegee Airmen, or the 99th, was no worse than any other fighter group. My dad was shot down twice. Strafing mission, and you made your first pass. That was your last pass. Well, this guy took him around for a second pass. Still no return fire. And this guy thought he would be smart. He put him in trail again, went around for a third pass. My dad said it was like the 4th of July. It all opened up. He said the next thing he knew, there was a hole between his feet. The cowling was split, and the guys on the ground were telling him to, or in the other airplanes, were telling him to bail out. Well, if you know anything about the old parachutes, if you're not up high enough, there's no way that that parachute's going to open, even if you're only up 1,000 feet. They didn't open up that quick. So he wound up belly landing, and the GIs came and rescued him and took him back to the base. Now, this was in April of '44. Yes?
Did you say that was his first mission or the first time he was shot down?
Oh, it was his 5th mission. That was the first time he was shot down. The second time he was shot down was May 24th, 1944. And that was because on Anzio Beach in Italy, there were railroad guns, and the Germans would ride these guns out at night, fire on the ships in the harbor, and then pull them back in the day. Well, my dad, with 7 other aircraft, were going to try to skip bombs in one of these railroad tunnels. And then he said the next thing you knew, again, the cowling, he said he was counting blades. The P-40 only had, Yep. The P-40 only has 3 blades. He said he could count the blades as they were turning. And the next thing you know, he made a turn and he could see black smoke coming out. Then the engine quit. And he had not, luckily, he had not taken the pin out, and his bombs were still safe because he was about ready to release the bombs on some British tom-toms. And then he realized that he better not do that, and he landed in a field, cartwheeled, and he said in cartwheeling, the canopy locked because he had already pulled the detent on the canopy, but it rolled forward and locked, and so he wound up, he wound up putting his feet on the floor and pushing his back as hard as he could to pop the canopy off. And he said he got about a half mile down the road when the plane finally blew. So twice. Go ahead, Jamie. This is a P-51. And this aircraft, as you can tell, my dad sometimes flew wing with a gentleman by the name of Elwood Driver. And Elwood Driver was really a part of the 100th. And I gotta stop for a second because in 1944, when my father first got to Italy, it was March 17th and 18th of 1944, Vesuvius had erupted. and it destroyed a lot of their aircraft. Ramitelli did not open until June of 1944, and that's when the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd were brought to Ramitelli with the 99th, and that's when they became the 332nd fighter group. This is Clarence sitting in his P-51. Kind of like that picture. Show the next one, Jane. There's Clarence. I don't know how this happened. Maybe John Peck can tell me. But it's almost the same exact pose as in World War II. He is sitting in an airplane called the Tuskegee Airmen. It's also called by request. It's a tribute to the Tuskegee Airmen. A man by the name of Hines restored it to help tell the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. And for several years, we used to go to Oshkosh, Wisconsin, for the EAA, Experimental Aircraft Association's meet. And that's Clarence sitting in that plane. Let's see. Clarence earns his Distinguished Flying Cross. I said he was shot down twice. He was shot down on May 24th, 1944. That was the second time. 3 days later, May 27th, he earns his Distinguished Flying Cross. I still have not been able to find out what heroic action he did to earn that Distinguished Flying Cross. We do know that he earned it, but I don't know exactly what he did to earn it. A few of his missions. My father flew 95 missions, 50 of them in the P-40 and 45 in a P-51. And some of you that are either World War II veterans or know about World War II, usually pilots were sent home after 50 missions. He stayed and flew 45 more. My dad earned the rank of going from second lieutenant to captain while he was at Ramitelli Airfield. And he became a flight leader. And right now, he's sitting in a P-51C or B, depends upon where it was built, to get the letter B or C. If it was built in California, it was a P-51C. If it was built in Texas, it was a B. He finally gets, and there's a picture in the back of a P-51D. That's the one that's most famous, and that's the one that's used in the movie Red Tails. But I'll tell you, all the Tuskegee Airmen did not have P-51Ds. My father didn't like the P-51D. He thought it was slow. He thought that the P-51C was more maneuverable. He also thought that you were more exposed if you were in the D because of the bubble canopy. Why that would bother him, I have no idea, because it doesn't matter to me which one you're in if they're firing at you. Clarence's final mission was March 24th, 1945. And he almost shot down what was known as the ME-262, but he forgot to switch his tanks, and so the plane got away. Most of his missions were strafing missions, and he also flew cover for bombers going to Romania, Ploesti, Romania, to the oil fields. And his worst mission was, coming back, they went to what's known as Lake Balaton in western Hungary. The Germans were retreating. And this is really sad, because what the Germans did was this. They took all of you, townspeople, and mixed them in with the German soldiers with horses and carts to bring their equipment out as they were retreating. My father is doing a strafing mission. Who do you think gets hit? The civilians and the German soldiers and the horses. And he tells students, you can just hear the noise from the horses and all the people dying on the ground. And just a quick little aside, I remember for Christmas, my aunt and uncle gave me a pair of 6-shooters. I thought I was the best kid on the block. Well, after a few weeks, those 6-shooters disappeared. And I now know why. My dad always had a warm heart for kids, because while at Ramitelli, the German children would come around to the base looking for food. So what they weren't supposed to, but what these men did would save their seconds to put in the pails of the kids so that they could take the food home to their families. And I don't know whether this is true or not. My sisters could tell me. But I think in a small way, that's why on just about every Sunday afternoon or evening, we got ice cream at our house. We would go to either the corner store or Stewart's or Dairy Queen, because I think it mainly was an appreciation for children that my dad had. Well, I've told you about his final mission. 2 Purple Hearts, an Air Medal, a Bronze Star, National Defense Service Medal, and I'm not sure what this one is, but this is what they told me at the county, the American Defense Service Medal, World War II Victory Medal, a VE Medal, Victory Over Europe Medal, and the New York State Capricious Medal, and I'm sure that there's a couple that I have left out. After the war, my dad, in 1946, was made an instructor at Tuskegee Army Airfield. And then in 1946, he was sent to Lockbourne, Ohio. And he said he got a little restless there because there wasn't much to do. And so he was discharged. And he went to California to go to Aero Industries Technical School, and he became a designing draftsman. In 1950, he married Millie Jackson. And then he went to work for General Electric. And while at work for General Electric, the Korean War broke out. And my dad wanted to go back into the service, but General Electric wouldn't let him because of the type of job he was doing. Now, when my dad went to work for General Electric in 1949, he almost didn't get the job remember, our country was still under segregation. And when he walked in, the receptionist told him there was no work for him. And just lucky enough, there was a recruiter that happened to be walking by as she was saying that to him and invited him into his office. And Clarence was smart enough to bring his portfolio with him. And the next thing you knew, the gentleman said, "Can you come to work on Tuesday?" So I think that when my dad went in, it was probably a Friday, and Monday was Labor Day, and then he went to work for General Electric. He worked at the main plant, again, as a designing draftsman. He then moved to flight test, and if some of you know where ECM is, the Empire State Air and Space Museum, that was flight test for a while, where they worked on radars and different things. And then he went to work for Capel. Now, a little aside about my dad. General Electric wouldn't let my dad go into the Korean War. They told him, the government, no, he wasn't going, because of all the top secret work they did. Well, I remember being in grade school, and we had what was known as the Federal Impact Statement. And that's how schools got money from the federal government for the number of federal workers that you had in your district. Saratoga must have done very well because we have the naval base out Route 29. Well, I remember bringing home the federal income tax, the Federal Impact Statement. I remember bringing it home, and I was almost in tears because my father wouldn't sign it to send it back to school. And his thing was, if they wanted to know what I do, you tell them to call me. He was not going to fill that form out. And I think that they've done away with it. I do know this. I think that there's maybe one engineer who worked with my dad here tonight. But some of his buddies would send him to talk to Admiral Rickover, the head of the nuclear navy. The engineers didn't want to go, but they would send my dad. And the reason why I know this is, in 1976, I had a college friend by the name of Peggy Ron, and I went to Washington, D.C. to visit her. And she took me to a party, and she was introducing me to a lot of her friends, and this young ensign came up and said, "Do you know a Clarence Dart?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm his son." And he goes, That's interesting, because Clarence comes to Washington, D.C., or when we go to Capel, he's the man that we talk to." So I was really quite surprised. Some honors. My dad did at ESAM a program called Aim High. He's on the Elmira, well, it's now Elmira High School. It was known as the Elmira Free Academy while he was there. He's on their Wall of Fame. He was on the Saratoga Springs Salvation Army Board. He loved kids, so he was on the board for the Charlton School for Girls, Saratoga Springs Methodist Finance Committee. He earned the Community Award from the Saratoga Springs Rotary, NAACP Man of the Year Award, Grand Marshal in an Elks Parade. He's been honored by the New York State Senate. He's on their Wall of Fame. Congressional Gold Medal, Niagara Community Niagara Mohawk Community Relations Board. They're now National Grid, and they did away with that. And he's been honored at least twice by the city of Saratoga Springs. Jamie, go ahead. My dad was in the class of 43J. I meant to show that a little bit sooner. And I'll tell you why that twin-engine plane is in the background. My dad's designation is SE-43J. Single engine, class of 43. What month? No, November. J is the 11th letter in the alphabet. The twin engine plane in the background, the arrow is my dad standing in the back, but the reason why that twin engine plane is there, because in his class of 29, some of them were TE-43J. Twin engine 43J. Because those men were shipped off to what was known as, in the film clip, the 47th Bomber Group. Go ahead, Jamie. Oh, that's good. That's good. Right there. That's my dad on the left with his sometime wingman, Elwood Driver. The next person to the right of Elwood Driver is Herbert Houston. And the last person on the right is Elwood Temple. Elwood Driver had just shot down an ME-109, and they're at Ramitelli discussing it. And if you go on the internet, that's a pretty famous picture because it's all over the internet when they talk about the Tuskegee Airmen. My dad also started a club, he and two other lieutenants. It's called the 3-Minute Egg Club. How many of you are chefs or cooks? Anybody still use a 3-minute egg timer? Well, here's why that's significant. In returning to the base, in order to get that into that club, you could only have 3 minutes of fuel remaining in your tanks. And I didn't say anything about this, but my father's final mission was a trip to Berlin, March 24, 1945. It was the longest mission. They went to bomb the I'll call it the Mercedes-Benz plant but that's not exactly it, but the Daimler-Benz plant. And it was approximately 16 hours. And to there and back, so 8 hours from the IP, the initial point, bomb, protect the bombers, and then back. B.O. Davis said that they couldn't leave the bombers. So you won't find too many, in fact, you won't find any Tuskegee Airmen that are aces. In order to become an ace, you had to shoot down 5 planes. B.O. Davis forbade it. In fact, he told his men if they left the fighter group, they would be court-martialed. Men all believed him. They all stayed with the fighters. There's a thing out there that says that the Tuskegee Airmen never lost a bomber in 200 missions. Well, that's not completely true. The losses were not as significant as other losses, but bombers were lost. Now I want you to think of this. You're going to Berlin with 700 bombers and 600 planes. Now, if you're good math students, think of the bombers with 10 to 11 men, B-24s and B-17s. 700, and you have 10 to 11 men on those bombers. Those bombers, if they get shot down, 11 deaths, 10 to 11 deaths could occur. And we know a bomber pilot that was a POW. Go ahead, Jeannie. That's Clarence and Millie Dart. I'm sure this is while they were dating. Go ahead. My dad earned the Congressional Gold Medal, and he's standing with Representative Kirsten Gillibrand, who hung his picture in her office. The Congressional Gold Medal is sitting back on the table. There's my mom and dad after the medal was awarded in the Capitol building. And my father was a Grand Marshal to the Elks Parade. This is now your brand new Joint Chiefs of Staff General. I better get his name right. I know it's General Brown, but I think it's Charles Q. Brown. He was the Chief of Staff for the Air Force, and, well, Tupperville didn't get his way. I hate to bring politics in, but he's a pain in the neck right now. Charles Q. Brown almost didn't get to be the Joint Chief of Staff. Second African American to have that role. General Colin Powell was the first. This is General Clark. He is the superintendent of the Air Force Academy. And the reason why I bring those two men up is because they both say that they have stood on the shoulders of Tuskegee Airmen. They stood on the shoulders of greatness. They proved to people that they could do what they said. My wife and I were fortunate enough on August 18th, 2017, to go to the dedication of those barracks. Those barracks, it doesn't show up very well, were dedicated to B.O. Davis, who was a graduate of West Point. While at West Point, no one would talk to him other than his instructors. He got the silent treatment for 4 years. He graduated 35th in his class. And there's General B.O. Davis as a cadet, and then a 4-star general. That's Mariel Tisingdale. She was the first and only Negro U-2 pilot. And there's our family after his first honor by the city of Saratoga Springs. And if you take a walk someday through the park and you're facing the entrance to the War Memorial, to the right, there are a group of benches and flags. Saratoga Springs, MLK, have honored my dad with a bench. And this is a lady by the name of Simone Askew. In this picture, Simone Askew is what is known to the cadets and the plebes, and if there are any West Pointers here, they'll know. She became the first woman Negro first captain of West Point. Yep. So I want to leave you with this. I asked you to take a look at that first slide. Why would these men fight for a country that fought so hard against them in peacetime? Well, if you haven't come up with an answer, I'm going to give you one of my own. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator. Oh, I screwed it up. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that ends my talk for this evening.